The opening hand in Magic the Gathering. A sea of possibility awaits. Will these 7 cards lay the groundwork for me to win this game? Please? No lands? Come on! Evaluating your opening hand is the first decision you get to make when you play a game of Magic, and as such, it is the single most important decision you'll make in that game. How the game will play out is determined above all else by the cards you start the game with. Sure, you'll draw at least one more card each turn for the remainder of the game, but you won't have much control over what those cards will be. With your opening hand, you do. If you don't like the 7 cards you drew, you might just want to take a mulligan. This video is meant to serve as a lesson in how to mulligan for intermediate players. It is an updated version of a guide that I made 6 years ago, oh my god, before the introduction of the London Mulligan, not to mention a shift in Magic card design that affected how mulligan decisions should be made. Now, many Magic the Gathering players already have a firm grasp on the fact that you should mulligan a hand that has no lands or no spells, but question, what about the hands in between? Should you ever mulligan a hand that has a mix of lands and spells? How does the deck you're playing impact the decision to mulligan? How have things changed with the London Mulligan? What are some common mistakes that players make with mulligans? This video will strive to answer all of those questions and more, and serve as the definitive Tolarian Community College guide to how to mulligan. Let's begin. But first, winter is coming, which means in order to go and buy groceries, you have to venture outside. Who knows if you'll make it back or if you'll freeze before you reach the first marker. Much better to play it safe and have your meals sent to you with a little help from Factor, sponsor of today's video. Factor offers chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. You can choose from dietary options like keto, calorie smart, vegan, and vegetarian, and more. With 35 different meal options each week, there's something for everyone. Meal plans range from 4 to 18 meals per week, and you can add more or reduce the number depending on your specific needs. You can easily modify food preferences and skip a week if needed, whatever you'd prefer. And real talk, Factor meals are a favorite here at Tolarian Community College, and seeing a Factor box arrive on our doorstep is something my staff gets genuinely excited about. Our Factor package never lasts long at our office either, and my staff divides up the meals and enjoys them throughout the week. This is absolutely true, by the way. They pretty much fight over who gets what in the box. What can I say? It's fast, easy, and tasty. And with Factor, meals means that you're never gonna break a sweat. That's because they arrive pre-prepared and ready to eat in 2 minutes or less, even faster than if you ordered takeout. Meal plans also offer 36 plus add-ons like smoothies, keto shakes, desserts, and more. So if you're ready for delicious, nutritious, and expeditious autumn grub, use my link or just go to go.factor75.com and use code POGTCCOCT50 for 50% off your first box. Click the link in this video's description or just scan this QR code with your phone. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring this video. If you're watching this video, chances are you know what a mulligan is. If you don't like your opening hand at the start of a game, you have the opportunity to shuffle it back and draw a fresh 7 cards. If you don't like that hand, you get to repeat this process. Once you settle on a hand you like, you must put a number of cards in the hand on the bottom of your library equal to the number of mulligans you took. Notice the language I used in that description. You have the opportunity to mulligan. You get to repeat the process. Taking a mulligan is not a punishment. It is a beneficial action you get to take if your opening hand isn't up to snuff. The action of taking a mulligan was made even more beneficial and less punishing when Wizards of the Coast changed the rule from the previous scry mulligan procedure to the procedure we have now, which is known as the London Mulligan. You still start with fewer cards for each mulligan you take, but you have more control over what those cards are, because because you get to pick them from among a fresh set of 7 cards. This is a huge deal. You already should not have been afraid to mulligan, but these days, that is especially true. Put simply, every time you take a mulligan, you get to look at 7 new cards for the low cost of 0 mana. So, when should you take a mulligan? It's not just about having a mix of lands and spells. You should have built your deck with a sense of the deck's game plan. What is your deck trying to do? When looking at your opening hand, the first question you should ask yourself is, are these cards going to help me execute my game plan? For many years now, Magic has favored a proactive approach to gameplay. Most of the cards on the battlefield are progressing you to the end of the game, either by attacking, dealing direct damage, or winning the game in another way using an alternative win condition. So when asking yourself, when do I mulligan, start by thinking about what the first couple of turns of the game will look like with your opening hand. Imagine you are in a vacuum, where your opponent casts no spells on their turns, and you draw no additional cards each turn. What does your hand do? Are the spells in your hand going to progress you toward your desired method for winning the game? And do the lands in your hand help you sequence those spells on curve? Curving out is the art of playing a land and using all your mana on each of your turns in the early game. On turn 2, you should have 2 lands and cast a 2 mana spell. On turn 3, 3 lands and a 3 mana spell. If, for example, you have an opening hand of 3 lands and 4 3 mana spells, that hand is setting you up to do nothing on turns 1 and 2. And even once you do start casting spells, your creatures will have diminishing returns over the course of the game. You will start to fall behind as your opponent casts increasingly bigger and more impactful spells while you are stuck casting 3-drop after 3-drop after 3-drop. Alternatively, if you have an opening hand of 3 lands and 4 interactive spells, consider what that means if you were to keep the hand. Even if your interaction lines up well against what your opponent is doing, and it might not, then you'll spend the first few turns disrupting their game plan without advancing your own. If you can't establish a clock of your own, your opponent will eventually run you out of gas and land a game-winning threat. A 6-card hand with a nice mix of interaction and proactive threats is going to be better on average than a clunky 7-card hand. Don't be afraid to mulligan if your opening 7 does not advance the strategy that you built your deck to execute. Now, once you've taken a mulligan, you'll have a new hand of 7 cards to evaluate. Should you stay put here and bottom one of those cards, or is it worth it to take a second mulligan? How do the rules for what makes a keepable hand change on your second mulligan decision? In the era of the London mulligan, taking a simple mulligan does not meaningfully impact your win probability. Taking a second mulligan does, of course, hurt more than taking just one, but even a good 5-card hand that you've curated from among the 7 you drew for your second mulligan has a reasonable chance of winning the game even against an opponent's 7-card hand. The biggest drop-off in win percentage only occurs when you've mulliganed down to a 4-card hand. That said, you should certainly be progressively more flexible with the hands you evaluate for each mulligan you've taken. It's hard to turn down a 5-card hand with 2 lands and 3 spells, or vice versa, even if the spells you're keeping are not ones you're thrilled about. How low you should feel comfortable mulliganing highly depends on the kind of deck that you've built. Different archetypes have different rules for what kinds of hands they're looking for based on the range of hands they're capable of winning with. In general, the higher your individual card quality is, the more card advantage you play, and the fewer pieces you need to win the game, the more you'll be able to overcome the drawback of starting the game with fewer cards than your opponent. Consider the 5 macro archetypes in Magic the Gathering. That is, Aggro, Midrange, Control, Combo, and Ramp. These 5 archetypes function very differently from one another and are therefore looking for a different array of cards in their opening hand. Aggro cards want a lot of cheap threats and only a couple lands, while control decks need plenty of card selection and mana to cast their spells. These archetypes, ranked in order of how willing they are to mulligan, are from most to least, combo being the most willing to mulligan, followed by ramp, midrange, control, and aggro being the least willing to mulligan of the 5. Why is that? Well, aggro decks generally play low mana cost cards that don't do very much on their own, but alongside other cheap cards will overwhelm your opponent before they've gotten their footing. These decks will also tend to play very little card advantage, meaning they don't often get to draw extra cards. When you mulligan to 5 with an aggro deck, you'll find it a lot harder to cross the finish line than you would playing any other archetype. When playing an aggro deck, you should feel confident mulliganing to 6, but I would not recommend going below that number if you can avoid it. Of course, if your 6-card hand has no lands, or fewer than 2 spells, you should of course mulligan, but do not be afraid to keep a 1-land hand on 6 cards with your aggro deck. Control decks are more willing to mulligan than aggro decks, but generally prefer not to do so if they can avoid it. These decks are built around trading for your opponent's cards 1 for 1, then pulling ahead with card advantage later in the game. Because of this card advantage, control decks can recoup some of the cards they lost on a low mulligan, but doing so means they are pulling themselves up to an even playing field rather than pulling ahead. It takes more divinations to pull ahead of your opponent's own cards if you started the game giving your opponent a free mind rot. That said, control decks live and die depending on 2 axes: whether they can answer their opponent's initial onslaught of pressure, and whether they can play a land every turn for the first 4 or 5 turns of the game. Therefore, when piloting a control deck, don't be afraid to mulligan if your 7-card hand doesn't have both enough lands and a piece of interaction or 2. On 6 cards, the most important thing is whether you have enough lands. If not, you'll have to go to 5 cards. On 5 cards, keep 3 lands, an interactive spell, and your cheapest source of card advantage. Midrange decks are ever so slightly more willing to mulligan than control decks. Midrange decks contain a mix of interaction and powerful standalone threats that can win the game on their own. Their average card quality in these decks is quite high, so mulligans are not as punishing as they might be in another archetype. That said, they're also less necessary, since your best cards don't need a lot of support to be good. In other words, midrange decks are simultaneously less concerned about mulliganing and less interested in doing so. When piloting a midrange deck, you should mulligan hands that don't have at least one of the standalone threats you built your deck around. A 5-card hand with a win condition will still be better than a 6-card hand that only contains lands and interaction. Continuing up the list, ramp decks are notorious for their ability to win a game out of nowhere thanks to a lucky top deck. These decks' absolute #1 priority is getting their mana into play. Once you've done that, your deck is full of cards that can take over the game all by themselves, going far over the top of whatever your opponent is trying to do. These decks are happy to mulligan as low as 5, and can even put up a great fight if they mulligan to 4. When mulliganing with a ramp deck, you should be looking to keep both a couple of ramp spells and mana to cast those spells. On a mulligan to 5, keeping 2 to 3 lands and 1 to 2 ramp spells is ideal. Only keep an expensive payoff in hand if you can do so without giving up access to sufficient ramp spells. At the top of our list, we have the combo decks. Combo is the archetype that has benefited the most from the London Mulligan. When you play a combo deck, you're capable of completely ignoring what your opponent is doing as long as you can assemble your game-winning combo in time. Additional cards in hand beyond your combo and mana to cast it are superfluous to winning the game, and as such, you should use those free 7 cards that mulligans show you with nothing short of absolute glee. If your opening hand doesn't have enough lands, then you should mulligan. If it doesn't have any of your combo pieces, then you should mulligan. If it has a combo piece, but no card selection to find your other combo piece, then you should mulligan. You should mulligan. You should mulligan. If you're playing combo, you should mulligan. Combo decks function perfectly fine on opening hands with as few as 4 cards. If you find yourself on a mulligan to 4, plan to keep 1 to 2 lands, as many combo pieces as you are able to, and fill out your remaining cards with cantrips and other card selection. You'll be spending the first couple turns sculpting your hand to set up for your combo, so prioritize the cards in your opening hand accordingly. There's one last quirk to mulligan decisions that's worth mentioning: evaluating your opening hand in a post-sideboard game. If you're playing a best-of-3 match of Magic, you're going to utilize your sideboard for your second game if you're playing a game after sideboarding. In post-board games, you know what deck you're playing against, and can thus evaluate an opening hand with more information than you would in Game 1. When looking at your opening hand in a post-board game, ask yourself a few questions. Is this a bad matchup? Are you the beatdown or the control deck in the matchup? What are your most important cards, and how badly do you need those important cards in order to win? If you are playing against a bad matchup, you don't want to make it worse by mulliganing to a low starting hand total. You're likely much more willing to keep a hand that's high risk, high reward. Maybe your hand isn't perfect, but it does have your impactful sideboard card that you brought in. Or maybe your hand is good at executing your game plan, provided your opponent doesn't have a disruption spell, and therefore you decide to keep the hand and quote-unquote make them have it. On the flip side, if you're playing a good matchup, you should try to keep as low risk of a hand as possible. Don't keep that risky 1 or 2 lander that doesn't have a clear path to finding additional lands. You'll be better off on a mulligan to 6 or even 5, since one of the main ways you can lose a good matchup is through the natural variance that can occur in a game of Magic. The best way to get better at mulligan decisions is to pay attention. Are you winning these games where you kept a risky hand? When you take a mulligan, are you noticing your 6-card hand looks better than your opening 7? How do games where you have to mulligan to 5 or 4 tend to play out for you? As you get more and more comfortable piloting your deck, you'll get better and better at determining what range of hands are keepable and which hands you're better off tossing back. You'll get a better feel for how well your deck functions on a low mulligan and how much it benefits from the ability to look at a fresh set of 7 cards from which to curate your opening hand. Mulliganing may not feel good at first, but the more comfortable you can get with the process, the more you'll find yourself winning. The decision whether to mulligan is the single most impactful tool at your disposal for setting yourself up for success. If you take nothing else away from this video, remember that you do not have to take a mulligan. You get to mulligan. And in learning these lessons and improving in these areas, I hope very much this video has been of some help to you. Would you like to see our new, updated, definitive guide to building a Commander mana base? A mana base for any Commander deck? Check out that video here or linked in this video's description. And remember, if you're looking for fast, delicious food delivered right to your door, check out Factor. Perfect to eat on game nights or when you need to get back to your PC to keep romancing a certain tiefling character. Yes, I know, we're all still obsessed with that game, I sure am. What do you think I've been doing between making videos? So if you're ready for that delicious, nutritious, and expeditious autumn grub, use my link or go to go.factor75.com and just use code POGTCCOCT50 for 50% off. Wow, your first box. Just click the link in this video's description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring this video.
Next time on Shuffle Up and Play, Kisses and Hugs.
Today, Aaron Hansen picks the format. What did you choose for us today, Aaron?
Under $50? This is Agnes the Dragon's Lash.
Hi, I'm Spencer Crittenden, Akeem the Soaring Wind.
My commander is Volrath the Fallen.
Hi there, I am Talia Vez, Yargle, and Multani.
Ah!
What?
Yargle! What do you live in a glen?
No, well, maybe.
Kind of.
This is a hard decision.
I don't think it is, just hit me.
Yeah, you're right. It's not a hard decision.
What? You haven't seen the
station agent?
He has a hat.
Oh, he doesn't have a hat.
Does anyone want to cut me?
Absolutely.
Not that way. But after the show, we can talk.